to start with a story. The first time I ever got in trouble in school, I was a kindergartner who just brought his Legos out with him to recess. Now, as nature runs its course, and as with most things that I owned at that age, I got them lost. I was devastated. I returned to class and was promptly berated by my teachers. However, only one student in that class had noticed or even cared enough about something so frivolous. For the sake of anonymity, I'll refer to him as John. The next day in class, John offered to replace my Legos with his. However, it was only years later after growing up with him that I realized the true importance of this gesture. Oftentimes, I noticed that I was the only one making any effort to include him. Whether it be in group projects or school lunch tables, he always seemed socially isolated and never really fit in. In truth, his autism spectrum disorder had greatly limited his ability to make social connections and vocalize his thoughts. And frankly, a lot of my peers just didn't have the patience necessary to overcome those barriers. I still remember sitting in middle school band class with him. We would play the trumpet, and whenever we would have a difficult measure or run of notes, I would be there to help him when others would turn a blind eye. I remember in group projects and discussions, Socratic seminars, I would help vocalize his thoughts for him so that everyone else knew that his perspective was just as valuable as ours. From his experience, I saw a little bit of myself in him. From being bullied in elementary and middle school, the anger that I felt turned into determination, a promise not to let him walk the same path that I had. Fast forward a couple of years, and unfortunately, we began to go distant. Focusing on different career goals and pathways, the bond that I had forged for nearly 8 years, a decade almost, had began to deteriorate and slip away through my own fingers. Seeing this and seeing the wasted effort that I had put in, I began to give up. I'd inadvertently cut him off. And in a way, I started growing even distant from myself. I started associating with people and groups that had sought to build what I had sought to destroy. I started associating with people who really weren't the nicest. When I joined these groups, I started disassociating or even interacting with other people because I thought that they were different than me, because they were different from my own friend groups. I stopped even acknowledging people because I believed that it would demote me on some artificial social scale. In truth, I was sacrificing my own morals in pursuit of some artificial social acceptance. This trail came to a head one day when I overheard some of my then friends discussing another classmate. I brushed it off, thought nothing of it, just teenagers talking, right? And then I started to pay closer attention to what they were saying and who they were talking about. The characteristics started to line up. The dots that they laid were familiar. When I connected them, that day, I openly witnessed John get verbally harassed, and I did nothing to stop it. I became obsessed with finding out the reason why. How could I have fallen from such moral character? How could my character have been compromised so deeply? What led me to this path? How did I join a community that had built and finalized the idea that I was trying to destroy? I believe in my journey, I've identified one large phenomenon that was responsible for plaguing our generation to this day. As a quick synopsis, the bystander effect theorizes that an individual is less likely to help a victim in the event that they are present with a group. The famous Darley-Latané study of the 1960s effectively theorized this. Participants, college-age students, were placed in an apparatus with another student. They were told to speak over an intercom to that other student who they couldn't see. Little did they know, however, there was no other student. It was a voice recording of an actor. They ran 3 trials. The first trial included a one-on-one discussion between the college student and the other student that they believed at the time. In reality, it was a tape recording. The other 2 trials consisted of the same apparatus. However, the participants were convinced that they were on the line with between 3 to 5 more participants also periodically joining in on the discussion. In the first trial, they periodically asked the tape recording actor on the other end of the line to start simulating the results or symptoms of a seizure, stuttering their words or calling for help, the experimenters then observed the reaction of the participants. What they found was pretty standard. Roughly 80% of all participants in that first trial chose to act. When faced with an immediate life or death scenario, they were the only one in that situation, and so they stepped up. However, the latter two trials were startling. They found that once you convinced the participant that there were just 5 more people on the line with them, 5 people that they couldn't see, remember, that rate dropped by 50%. Nearly half did nothing. The researchers chalked this up to the idea of the diffusion of responsibility. The idea that you are less likely to hold yourself accountable, where your own individual responsibility role is decreased and spread amongst another group if you are in presence with a group. However, there was one heavy confounding variable within the TEDxOlathe study. The problem was, amongst the 5 to 3 other participants in the trial, the 5 other tape recordings in those latter 2 groups, those actors were instructed to be passive. They were told not to egg on the lab participant and encourage them to act. They were told not to say anything when the initial actor was calling for help during their procedure. And so it wasn't the diffusion of responsibility that was causing the participant not to act. It was confusion. If there were others present, why was nobody else acting? Our brains are wired to find a rationale behind reason. We always ask why. Why would somebody do something? Why would this action occur? And so in that scenario, when they couldn't find a why behind why those other 5 participants were choosing inaction, they believed that they knew something that they didn't. And so conformity arose. They fit in with the crowd, and they assumed that others knew better than they did, even when right in front of them, another participant was struggling with a seizure. In the study, the TEDxOlathe study specifically, they found that these participants had no differentiating characteristic. They came from all races, all demographics, and they had nothing in common with another or anything that set them apart from each other. So it wasn't a demographic or a certain type of person or characteristic that led them not to act. In truth, they had normalized a silent acceptance of complicity. The opposite of action didn't result from inaction, rather, it became indifference. We're faced with this indifference every day of our lives. Look at social media, for example, right? How many times have you seen a potentially harmful reel, TikTok, or upload, and ask yourself, how many times have you seen someone make a truly meaningful impact or intervene? We oftentimes sacrifice our morals in pursuit of this social acceptance. In the case of social media, the gauge for self-worth has overshadowed empathy. And in this scenario, it's an example that's going to be lost to time because it's created from the seeds that it sows. Conformity. Whether it's to prove something about ourselves or to prove something to others, we do what's necessary to be like everybody else. And so in the TEDxOlathe study, the participants had realized that not taking action was the favored response. And worse yet, a favored response becomes an acceptable response. And so in that moment, they had justified that by not acting to save another individual's life, they were justified in their choice not to act. However, I want to end on a high note. And in that same TEDxOlathe study, there is one caveat to their conclusion. Remember how I said that nearly half chose not to act in that latter study? Well, that means that the other half did act. And so the question then became, what motivated that other 50% to do something even in the presence of a group of other individuals? And so that's exactly what they did. They studied that group. And they found that they also, too, had no defining or differentiating characteristics. They were the same group of people all along. It didn't take anything different from them and the people who didn't act. And what they found was startling. They found that those participants, although they were confused on whether or not they should act or not, They found that in the presence of just one individual willing to step up, the chances that another will follow increased exponentially. And I get that the connection to today is difficult. It's hard to be the first person to act. It's hard. It really is difficult because you never know whether it's a risk or not. You don't know if your action today will have an immediate action tomorrow, whether that response will be worth it. As someone who's been on both sides of action and inaction, I've waited nearly a decade to try to work towards something and have seen it crumble between my own hands of my own creation. But you have to understand that in that moment we have a choice. A choice between action and inaction, and sometimes we can't afford to do nothing, simply because we don't know who's on the other end of the line. If you take any lesson away from today's parable, I urge you and implore you to remember, the sin of omission is a failure to do something right. Thank you.